All right, good morning again. We will start the day off today with the lead and copper rule that is found in Module 4 of your book. So upon completion of this module, hopefully you'll be able to define what's in the lead and copper rule. What are the requirements of sampling? Getting these samples to the lab. What is required as far as public notification? What do we do with the lead service lines if we have any in the systems? And so that's what we'll talk about. We'll look at the regulatory overview of the actual rule. We'll look at the health effects of lead and copper, and we'll talk about sampling methods for lead and copper. We'll define what the action levels are for lead and copper. Anyone happen to know what they are?
1.3 and 0.02.
Okay, very good on the 1.3 milligrams per liter or parts per million for copper and 0.015 for lead, parts per million, or 15 parts per billion. Okay, 0.015? Okay, cool. All right, and we're going to talk about public education, what all that entails, making sure the public is aware. What can they do to mitigate the effects of lead and copper in their water? And then the last thing that we'll talk about is the treatment for lead and copper. There are a lot of different options that are out there, and so we just want to expose what the rule says that is good to do. All right, in the past, when you look at why we are here, why the lead and copper rule, when you look at past and history application of lead and copper, we see lots of application with a lot of different industry for two different reasons. It was cheap and it was available. And so before many investigations was done as far as what were the long-term effects, cheap availability, put it in, good to go. Over the years, what we've discovered, though, is that it does have some health risks associated to lead and copper exposure, and we're on 4-3. We see developmental problems in children as it relates back to lead exposure. Not only that, as far as copper, whenever there's a huge amount of lead and copper, there's an increased effect from other contaminants such as nitrites and nitrates. Now, why is that a big issue for us? Because when you have too many nitrates in your water, there's a syndrome that's called the blue baby syndrome. And it's okay to talk, this is your class. And that way you won't hear me just say wah, 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 wah for 6 hours. The blue baby syndromes. What is the blue baby syndrome? The blue baby syndrome occurs when nitrate levels exceed the 10 milligram per liter as far as the maximum contaminant level, and it's in your water, and you feed your baby this via formula or milk. The body prefers, or the baby's body prefers, the nitrate over the oxygen. And however, oxygen is necessary for red blood cell development, right? So the body takes in the nitrate over the oxygen, and because now there's no oxygen in the red blood cells, the baby suffocate. Hence, blue baby syndrome. Literally, there's a suffocation. It affects the very young, and we're talking under 6 months of age. And so that's why, again, when you have huge amount of lead and copper, you're going to magnify the nitrate that may be there. So the purpose of the lead and copper rule was to minimize exposure to lead and copper from your drinking water source. In 1991, EPA promulgated the maximum contaminant level goals. Now, what are maximum contaminant level goals? What's meant by that? And how are goals different from the limits, MCLs? Well, all a goal is the level which no known health effect or health risk occur. That is meant by goal. That is the level of contaminant that can be present at which there's no ill effect from or health issues from that particular contaminant. Limit is the maximum contaminant level limit is the limit that's set close to the goal, but now we recognize there are health effects or health risks when you exceed that particular limit. Okay? 2007, there were minor revisions to the lead and copper rule. And again, the primary goal was protection, maximum health protection from lead and copper. Now, this rule is applicable to all community water systems as well as non-community, non-transient community water systems. Now, we need to define what is a community water system.
Any public water system over 15 people?
Okay, so we have a public water system that provides water, potable water for drinking, a minimum of 15 service connection, 20 or 25 individual for at least 60 days out of a year. A community system, you have the same criteria, but we're now providing pipe water year-round basis. So a community water system has a minimum of 15 service connection or 25 individual year-round basis. A non-transient, non-community system, again, we're looking at least 15 service connection or 25 individual over a 6-month period. An example of a community water system, municipalities, cities. An example of a non-transient, non-community water system, daycare, factories. Give me another one. Manufacturing plant, because you have the same 25 individuals coming and going for at least 6 months out of the year. So those are the difference there. Question or comment? Okay. Now, as far as your non-community water system, it says you must optimize corrosion and periodic sampling there. Some of the health effects of lead and copper, as far as copper goes, for the infants and young children, blue baby syndrome, and we've already talked about what the blue baby syndrome is. And again, when you have excess amount of copper, lead in your lines, it's going to magnify the nitrate ingestion. And that's the reason we have to minimize the levels of lead and copper that are there. As well as blue baby syndrome, we also see gastrointestinal effect. That can be anything as mild as cramps to severe diarrhea. And we see the same effects of copper in adults. Now, as far as lead, the list just got a lot longer. Now for lead, some of the health effects, we see low birth rate. We see a slowdown of physical and mental development. There may be damage to hearing, reduction of attention span, or poor classroom performance. All of this is attributed to excessive amount of lead in your drinking water. For adults, kidney damage. That was interesting. The second one really was interesting to me, increased blood pressure. Did you know that, again, exposure to excessive amount of lead could lead to high blood pressure? Yeah. Damage to the reproductive system. So now you can see why it's so critical to maintain adequate levels below the maximum contaminant levels of lead and copper in our drinking water source. Any questions or comments at this point? All right, now with the health effects of lead and copper, let's say you perform your initial lead and copper monitoring, or it's just now routine monitoring that you're doing, less frequency. If there was exceedance of lead and copper, you must put this type of information as far as in the report and the educational public notification. Infants and young children are typically more vulnerable to lead in drinking water than the general population. The other thing we want to notify the public is that elevated levels of lead and copper can cause serious health problems. especially for pregnant women and young children. The other thing, lead in drinking water is primarily from material and components associated with service lines and home plumbing. Okay, and with this statement here, it may be that your particular house may be a little higher than your neighbor's house. Why? Because you may have different components as a part of your personal home plumbing. Make sense? Yeah. All right, so other part of the public notification is you can tell customers you can minimize your exposure by letting the water run until there's a temperature change. You remember Mama used to tell you that. Don't drink out of the first water, let it run 2 minutes or so. Okay, so 30 seconds, 2 minutes. Now we flushed out all of that water that may be saturated with lead and copper. Because what's happening, where are we getting the lead and copper from? Is it coming from our source water? No. Where is it coming from? Okay. Absolutely, the fixtures, the home plumbing and so forth like that. Water is stagnant in the lines. Lead and copper will leach out into your drinking water source. So if you allow the water to run that 30 seconds, 2 minutes, or until there's a temperature change, now we've displaced all that water that's in our lines, and now we know we have freshly chlorinated water coming in. So let the water run for at least 2 minutes. And the other thing we want to let the public know, if you're still concerned about the lead and copper amount, have your individual water tested. And we need to be able to point them to where they need to go for that to happen. You can also give them the 1-800 number EPA for the Safe Drinking Water Hotline in case if they have further questions. A system may write its own educational statement, but that is with the stamp of approval from the state primacy agency. Who's your state primacy agency? Huh? Say a little louder for.
Office of Drinking Water, EPA.
Okay, cool. All right, sampling for lead and copper. We're on 4-5. There are very specific instruction for sampling and testing as a component of this rule. Selection of your sampling points, collection of sample analyzing, as well as data gathering for samples. Now, who collects your lead and copper samples? Huh? Customers? The state? Customers too. Okay, cool. And we'll address both situations, if you have customers collecting or the state collecting them. The size of the water system determines the number of sample required. In other words, population. Okay, it's all based on population will dictate the number of samples. For small systems, and that's what we are gearing this training around, from 501 to 3,300 population, you're looking at, for the first round of sampling, at least 20 sites and 2 water quality parameter sites. Once you've done that initial round of testing, that can be reduced to 10 for that size system. From 101 to 500, you're looking at 10 sample sites for lead and copper, reduced to 5 if you're on the reduced monitoring. And if you have less than 100 individuals, 5 sample sites, but again, that never is reduced because the EPA requires a minimum of 5 sampling sites, at least 1 water quality parameter site. So that's the number of sites. How do I know where to go to pool? How do I determine which sites are applicable? Survey? What do you mean by a survey?
When you got different tier levels of your construction, different phases of when the properties were built and different materials used on it.
Very good, Bubba. Did you all hear what Bubba said? And he's absolutely right. It will depend upon, again, the various tiers. There are 3 tiers for lead and copper sampling that we will talk about. And he suggests maybe doing a survey to determine when the plumbing was installed, when was the home built, because based on that, it will fall into 1 or 2 or 3 tiers, okay? So the age of the system is one thing that we're going to go by. The other thing is whether or not it's a single or multi-family unit, because that will put it either in 1 and 3 or 2 as far as the number of tiers. The other thing is you want to make sure that you are getting it from a tap where there is human consumption. Does no good to go outdoors to the outside faucet. You want to make sure we're protecting who? The public. So human consumption. So usually this is a kitchen or bathroom tap. And this falls up under the short-term revision of the lead and copper rule. Now what if your system, because if we have under 100 people or 100 people or less, what if we have fewer than 5 taps? What do we do? If you have fewer than 5 taps, you must sample each tap that provides water for human consumption at least once. Okay, that's what that says there. All sample taps must be taken at least once. Yes, sir.
Back up on the kitchen and bathroom taps. They also have to be taps that will not be used overnight.
Yes, and we're going to get into that. Yes, you're ahead of the...
Sorry.
That's okay, but you're absolutely right. We'll stipulate what the requirements are in a minute. Repeat samples, take repeat samples on different days until a total of 5 samples are obtained, and that is if you have an exceedance. Primacy agency have the discretion to allow the system with fewer than 5 taps to collect 1 sample from each tap that can be used for human consumption. But again, you got to put in that request if you want to be able to do that, okay? If your system is less than 5 samples are required to use the highest test result as the 90th percentile level. What is meant by that 90th percentile level?
Depending on the number of samples that you are tested, if you do take a hit on either of the contaminants, whether it be lead or copper, they take the number of samples that didn't have the exceedance, and it's an average based on how many were good and which one was bad.
Okay, so the key here is if more than 10% exceeded, you've exceeded the limits there. Got that?
If you drew 10 samples and 1 sample was bad, you still were within the 90th percentile. If you had 2, then you're done.
Yeah.
80%.
That means now we have to kick into, again, a higher frequency of monitoring. Does that make sense? That's why these are action levels as opposed to maximum contaminant levels. Another short-term revision, it allowed reduction to lead and copper sampling frequency to once per year. But again, you got to collect at least 1 sample per tap that can be used for human consumption. And some systems can reduce their monitoring to once every 3 years. EPA allows systems to collect fewer than 5 samples, but again, they want to make sure that they're hitting every tap there is human consumption from. All right, types of sampling sites. Sites must be approved in writing by the primacy agency. So in other words, after you've done your survey, you've submitted the addresses where the sampling points will be. They'll give you the stamp of approval. It meets the criteria. Now, what's the criteria? There are 3 tiers of sampling for lead and copper. How many tiers of sampling for lead and copper? 3. What are they? Tier 1, as far as your site criteria, we're looking at a single family structure that contained copper pipes with lead solder installed after 1982. Or it could be served by a lead service line. So single family after 1982. Tier 2, we have the multifamily or buildings that contain copper pipes, lead solder, installed after 1982, and or served by a lead service line. Here again, the only difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 is what? Multifamily. So same criteria, installed after 1982. So what do you think Tier 3 will be? Single family? Absolutely. With copper pipes, lead solder, installed prior to 1983. Okay? And if you have a non-transient, non-community system, you can only use 1 in 3 tiers for your sample site collection. In other words, you're going to the single homes, sample sites, either after 1982 or prior to 1983. Questions on the 3 tiers? All right. 50% of your samples collected during each monitoring period from sites that contain lead pipes or copper pipes with lead solder, and 50% of your samples must be from a lead service line. All right, so now collecting sample. What are the rules? In order to collect the samples, any type of analysis you're going to run for reporting purposes must be collected in an approved manner, and the analysis must also be in an approved manner or method, EPA approved. Now, as far as pH, water quality parameters, pH, conductivity, alkalinity, any laboratory, any approved field kit can be utilized to perform those analyses. Lead and copper must be run by an approved certified laboratory. Lead and copper must be run by a certified laboratory. And that's the reason in a lot of cases the state will perform their own collection utilizing the state laboratory because it's certified. So we want to utilize the Code of Federal Register 141.86 for your collection procedures, so please refer back to that. The other thing that Bubba pointed out earlier is that you want to make sure prior to pulling this sample, the water must be stagnant for a minimum of 6 hours, no more than 18. So we want that water to be stagnant in the pipes from 6 to 18 hours. We're going to pull the first draw. So you have a liter bottle. You're going to pull from the cold tap the first draw. Do not allow the water to flush out because that's what we're trying to determine. Was there an issue with lead and copper? So first draw after it has stood motionless 6 to 18 hours. Now, as far as acidification, in order to run the analysis, the samples should be acidified. However, if customers are collecting their samples, generally we put no acid in that bottle because of the safety hazards involved with acid in the bottle. So because of that, EPA said that you can have up to 14 days after collection to acidify your samples. Now, if you are allowing customers to pull samples for you, please, please, please walk through the method that you want them to perform. Have it written down of proper sample collection. Because at the end of the day, if you submit those samples for testing, and if the results come back higher than what you expected, the systems may not challenge the results if they allow customers to pool the samples. You can't challenge them. Okay, so do know that.
In the past, we've had problems in schools where we'd allow the custodians to collect the samples. We always had high levels, and we actually started doing it ourselves.
Very good. Do you think they were collecting it from the janitorial sink?
No, we think that they were basically not collecting them on time. They would just, at the end of the shift, they'd just go ahead and do it.
Oh.
Keep them overnight. They were too short on time.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the only time I've taken a hit too, so it's been done by the customer.
Okay. So again, if it's not in writing, they may not follow through. So you want to make sure if you're going to give them that leeway to collect, make sure they understand the proper procedure for collection and how critical it is. All right, for collecting lead service line, now here, unlike the first draw, we want that water to wash out whatever is there because now I want to see what's coming from that service line. So with this sample, you're going to collect it at the tap after flushing the volume of water between the tap and the lead service line, because that's what I want to test. I want a representative sample from the lead service line. The other alternative, you can tap directly into the lead service line, and that way you don't have to worry about calculating the distance, how much flow based on the pipe size. Just tap into that lead service line, you're good to go. For single-family residents, allow the water to run again till there's a significant change. Now I know I'm pulling from the actual service line. Does that make sense? Cool. Now, small or medium systems exceeding the action levels must monitor the following at taps and entry points in the distribution system. These are those water qualities parameters that were listed in that table, the WQPs. We're going to test for pH, alkalinity, orthophosphate or silica, and that's when they are used, so only when applicable. Calcium, conductivity, and water temperature. Now we're doing these water parameters not only at the tap, but the entries to the distribution system. Okay? It's 2 places. Now to qualify for reduced sampling, number one, you have to be below the action level for 2 previous 6-month period. That's the first thing. You have to demonstrate this is representative of my water. I don't have this issue. 2 consecutive 6-month period. And you must include the parameters on the previous slide, the pH, conductivity, orthophosphate, all of those things, temperature. So that way you can qualify for reduced sampling. Are any of you all on the reduced sampling? Okay, cool. Don't know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we are.
Okay.
One district, yes, the other one, no.
Okay. All right, so doing the initial monitoring, and I think this one is in your book on page 410. We're going to test for pH, alkalinity, orthophosphate, silica, calcium, conductivity, and temperature at the taps and at entry points every 6 months. That was during the initial monitoring period. After installation of corrosion control, we're still doing the pH, alkalinity, orthophosphate, silica at your taps every 6 months. We're doing pH, alkalinity, dosage rate, and concentration if it's a part of your corrosion control, and inhibitor dosage rate, inhibitor residual, again, if it's a part of your corrosion control, every point to the distribution, entry point to the distribution system, and that one will be at least every 2 weeks, no less than every 2 weeks. Okay. If the state specifies parameter values for optimum corrosion control, we're still doing that first little segment, pH, alkalinity, orthophosphate, silica, calcium at the taps every 6 months. And we're doing the inhibitor dosage rate, concentration, pH, alkalinity, dosage to your entry points, and again, every 2 weeks. So that's the frequency. If we have been allowed to do the reduced monitoring, if we're on that right there, you're looking at those same parameters at the tap every 6 months or annually or every 3 years for the reduced number of sites. And remember, if I were at the 501 to 3300, that dropped me from 20 to 10 sites. The 101 to 500, that dropped me from 10 to 5 sites. Okay. And again, these right here, we're still doing at least every 2 weeks, not less than every 2 weeks as far as the concentration, the dosage. Okay. Questions? Clear as mud? All right, analyzing the samples. Now we have the samples collected. In an approved method, we're now going to send it to a certified lab to run an EPA-approved method for analyzing the sample. So utilize methods 141.23 K1 for lead, copper, pH, conductivity, calcium, alkalinity, orthophosphate, silica, and temperature. And again, they point out and they really specify your lead and copper must be conducted by certified laboratories. Have the results back. Now you have 10 days following the end of each applicable monitoring period. So 10 days after that monitoring period ends, 10 days, that report must be submitted to your state primacy agency or EPA. So that means every 6 months, 10 days after, end of the annual, or 3 years or 9 years, whichever cycle you're on. But you got to report it within the first 10 days after that monitoring period. 90th percentile lead and copper concentration measured from the among the lead and copper tap water samples is some of the things you have to report. The results of the samples collected at the entry point to the distribution system, and all water quality parameters during the 6 months monitoring period. That what must be included on that report. Okay, other things that we have to notify the state. If you have a new source, you got to notify the state. If you're doing a long-term change in treatment, such as you're using the existing chemicals, but you've adjusted your dosage for whatever reason, you have to notify the state. And remember, you're gathering that information anyway, at least every 2 weeks. Got to notify the state. If you're modifying the existing treatment procedures, you have to notify the state. Let's say I'm switching my secondary disinfectant. I'm going from chlorine to chloramines. I have to get their approval. If I'm switching coagulants, going from the ferric to the alums, I got to notify the state. Or if I'm switching my corrosion inhibitor products, notify the state prior to doing it. Why do you think it's critical to notify them before making these major changes? And the room is silent. Do you agree with that you should notify them? It's going to affect the quality or the outcome of your water, any changes you make. Now those changes can be and should be for the betterment, but in some cases it can go south on you real quick. So before you make any major change, notify, get their blessing. That way we're not having to come back reporting notice of violation because of improper notification. All right, other reporting requirements for our source water monitoring. We have to report the results within 10 days following the end of each source water monitoring period. Failure to collect from specified sites must be accompanied with an explanation why the sampling point has changed. Okay, so I can't just go willy-nilly, oh, I'm going to collect from this home instead of this home if it was not part of my original sampling siting plan submitted and approved by the state. I got to make sure I'm following up as to why I made that decision. All right, for corrosion control treatment reporting, we're going to report to them recommendations for optimizing corrosion control. We're going to demonstrate the optimization. They may even require data evaluating the effectiveness of your corrosion control, accompanied by a letter certifying that, hey, we've installed the treatment that we've agreed upon and it's in place and we're monitoring it. So that letter must also be submitted to the state. Any questions? All right, if we're going to treat our source water, if the problem lies there, that too must be reported. Recommendation regarding source water treatment, and again, the letter certifying that if that's what we're doing, that that's been implemented, and we have 24 months in order to do that. 24 months to implement it, install it, and certify it. All right, now initially when this rule came out, EPA did provide a provision for replacement of your lead service lines. Systems exceeding the action level for lead and copper no later than 12 months after the end of the monitoring period should demonstrate in writing to the state it has conducted the material evaluation. In other words, we've done the investigation. They identify the initial number of lead service line in the distribution system. Then from that point, what EPA says is that on an annual basis, you must schedule at least 7% of replacement. So schedule to replace at least 7% of the initial number of lead service line on an annual basis. In addition to that, you must conduct sampling which demonstrate the lead concentration in all service lines is equal or less than 0.015 milligrams per liter, which is the action level. So even though we're replacing, we're still making sure. Now the last component of this rule deals with the public education. Public education reporting, you want to provide a list of newspaper, radio stations, television stations, facility where the notice was delivered. We're going to do the additional monitoring and reporting. Extra samples must be reported. Now on this right here, do any of you all just collect more than the number that's required? Let's say you have 10 sites, but you're collecting 15 sites. When you do that in an approved method, you must report those results. Realize that? Cool. Now, record keeping, you want to make sure that you're retaining all records no fewer than 12 years. So we are reporting within how many days? 10. And you got to maintain these records for a minimum 12 years. The lead action level, 0.015 milligrams per liter or 15 micrograms per liter. Other people like to refer to it as 15 parts per billion. Copper action level, 1.3 milligrams per liter. Now when levels are exceeded at the 90th percentile sample, the following is required. And again, that 90th percentile is when you have 10% more. So when it's exceeded, I got to do the water quality parameter monitoring. Remember that was the pH, the conductivity, alkalinity, and all of that. We're going to collect samples at taps every 6 months, entry points 6 months prior to corrosion control treatment, then every 2 weeks after that. Every 2 weeks, and that's the minimum. Reduce sampling if parameters are met for 6 consecutive months, 2 of those periods there. You can then go to an annual monitoring. And again, reduce sampling if parameters are met for 3 annual monitoring period. Now you're on a once every 3 years, triannually. Okay? And again, these are the parameters that you're going to be monitoring at a minimum of every 2 weeks with the action level exceedance. So, we pulled the sample, we've run the analysis, we've had an exceedance. What's next? Corrosion control treatment. Now, your corrosion control treatment must be completed by large systems. You don't have an out. Small systems, medium systems are only required to do it by the state, and they're given 18 months to complete the study. So you have a little more leeway. You want to make sure that you're working very closely with your state agency. Systems will have 24 months to install the system for corrosion control. And they must perform 2 consecutive 6 monitoring of their taps and water quality parameters, just to make sure that everything's okay before they can be put on a reduced system monitoring. Small systems may stop the CCTs if the system is less than or equal to the action level, again for the 2 consecutive monitoring periods. But you got to prove that first before you can go to that reduction or cessation. Now, the only way you can do this, of course, is with the state approval, with the small systems, okay? Source monitoring is a must if the action level is exceeded. In other words, that's one of the requirements. You gotta do your source water monitoring. 1 set of samples for your entry point to the distribution system is required within 6 months of the first exceedance. System has 24 months to implement whatever required source water treatment. Then thereafter, groundwater systems are to be monitored every 3 years, surface water every year or annually. Now, keep in mind, reduced monitoring is possible, but what do you think you have to prove in order to be on that reduced monitoring? Number 1, I must show that there is no more exceedance of the action levels, right? And it has to be done for at least 2 6 months monitoring period, consecutive monitoring period. All right, public education, supplemental monitoring is what we're about to talk about now, and the content of that written public education as well as a notification process. The education that is required as far as to the public, we want to let them know the health effects of lead. And who can tell me some of the health effects of lead? Hey. So slow development. Okay, absolutely. It impairs your mental capability. Gastrointestinal effects. Excellent. In addition to the health effects, we want to then point out where the sources are coming from. Let them know that. Tell consumers how to get their water tested. And again, you want to make sure this posting is in places that are frequented by women and children. And we want to make sure we go back. If I'm pulling from Virginia's home, or if she's pulling for me, I want to alert her as to what her results were also. We're going to notify the public about the replacement of the lead service line, the 7% annually. Try to let them know 45 days ahead of time because there may be an increase in the amount of lead during that time. Collect samples 72 hours of replacement, and again, provide results within 3 days of receipt of those results. Some compliance option, we can perform corrosion study. You can add orthophosphate or silica-based chemicals, which is probably the easiest option to implement. You can also utilize alkalinity-based chemicals such as lime, soda ash, caustic soda. All that's doing is doing what to the pH? Raising the pH. And now when my pH is at or near neutral or above 7, then corrosion does not occur, because corrosion will happen at lower pHs. And Bubba and I were talking earlier, and he was saying that naturally his groundwater, slightly acidic, but not too much, 6.5 or so like that. But if you have, again, naturally occurring iron plus the lower pH, it's going to increase the corrosivity that may be there. So that would be an issue where the source water could be part of the problem. Treatments must be approved by the state regulatory agency. This calculation of stability index is using methods such as the Bayes curve or your calcium index calculation in order to see whether or not your water is corrosive or scale forming. Bayes curve will utilize alkalinity and pH. Very simple curve. If you know those two, you plot those two, and there is a line for stable water, And depending on what side of the line you fall on, you know whether or not your water is corrosive or scale forming. All right. Are there any questions, comments, or issues as far as lead and copper rule goes?
Now, will we see changes in, the MCLs with the lead and copper, with the new no lead?
That is something that we are keeping our eyes on to see how that will affect, because I'm pretty sure because of that you will see it. But I say I am. That's Bessie
Right.
personally. But of course it has to go through the process when that comes.
2014, we're supposed to be no lead here. And Maryland has already switched to no lead brass.
No lead, okay. The rest of, you said Maryland, so Delaware is already there. So how that will affect EPA and the rules that are there, it's always or usually a trickle-down effect. So that could be something possibly coming down the pipe. But again, they've done the study, and the way EPA come up with these limits is actually doing the study, seeing what the health effects are, and at what level we start seeing those health risks. And based on that, that's where the number is put in. As far as the maximum, good question. Any other questions or comments? Everybody's on board with the lead and copper, understand it well, good to go?
No, I have my issues with it, but that's, you know, I mean, why should I be responsible for what's inside their house? It gets to the meter pit, comes out that meter pit, it's on them.
So most of your exceedance is because of the homeowners? What do you all do in a case like that?
We've gone out, we've resampled and all that.
But do
It
you
was-
educate
it was
the
normal.
homeowners,
Oh, yeah.
whereas they
Let
can
it
change them
do.
over? Now, initially, another part of it was in Texas, initially. What the utility said was, okay, we'll change out, but at your expense. Did you
Well,
all
did
do
we
that
ever-
also?
No.
No, you don't do it.
Because it was homeowner error.
Right,
You know,
right,
I'm a firm believer, if you give them a chance to screw something up, they'll do it.
okay.
You know, if I'm gonna be responsible for the quality, then I'm gonna be the one to draw the sample. You know, we took a hit on the lead, and come to find out it was because the homeowner didn't draw the sample right.
Oh, did draw the sample, so not necessarily the plumbing, but just the pulling of the sample.
Right, I mean,
Okay.
I photo documented the plumbing and everything. I mean, you come out of SDR black poly pipe to one fitting to a commode and a sink. There's not a lot of brass there to have a lot of lead and
Yeah.
copper. You know,
Yeah.
but, you know, there was an exceedance, and that's all they had was one restroom.
Wow,
But they used the sink for making coffee, and if they wanted to drink water,
yeah, it was human consumption,
yeah.
it's a stipulation.
And we
Okay.
took, you know, it's.
So in a case like that, it may behoove me to say, okay, I'll provide the labor, you provide the parts.
Right,
Yeah, if I'm taking the hit, because keep in mind, not only when there's an exceedance, it affects me big time, because now I got to go back to source monitoring and all of that, and all those other parameters. So count the cost up. Count the cost.
yeah, I'm on my third round of water quality parameters and stuff this year,
Yeah.
since it's passed. Yeah, it's not fun.
No, not by a long shot. All right, any other questions? All right, we'll take a break.